Hello and welcome to this presentation on workforce planning in the disability sector. This presentation is a partnership between SACS Consulting and NDIS, National Disability Services here in Australia. In this presentation we're going to look at the current situation in the disability sector, the post-COVID world, what will be the new normal, and we're going to recommend an approach to workforce planning which may help you to plan for how you're going to respond to the coming challenges over the next 2 to 3 years. So firstly, just a brief description of SACS. SACS is an organisational psychology business. So we've been involved in many major workforce planning projects over the past 10 years in particular. But in addition to that, many people in the disability sector buy psych tests from us. We undertake wellbeing and 360-degree feedback surveys. We are involved in individual and organisational development, and we undertake recruitment processes, particularly design and delivery of recruitment processes. We're scientist practitioners, which means that we undertake primary research. Deakin Uni is our main research partner, and we are evidence-based in our approach to people management. So that's a little bit about SACS. So our objectives from this presentation, we want to look at the current challenges facing the sector and address this vexed question of what the new normal is likely to be. Right now, as I record this, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis. And it's a really interesting question. What will the new normal look like once we get out the other side? What is workforce planning and how can it help? We're also going to show you the NDIS capability framework and its implications. So the NDIS capability framework is of interest to those who are watching this in Australia. And certainly it's an Australia-wide phenomenon or Australia-wide resource which has been developed for members of the sector. And we're going to give you some recommendations regarding actions to undertake workforce planning. But firstly, some stuff about the new normal. So you can see that we found information from KPMG, PwC, Ernst & Young, McKinsey and Deloitte about what they think is going to happen in the new normal, what the new normal is likely to be. And so a range of different ideas, but they seem to fit into 4 categories: work and workforce culture, technology and infrastructure, and business and operating models. So firstly, what we're seeing is virtually everybody is talking about reskilling and retraining employees, remote work being far more a normal part of people's working lives, greater agility and flexibility, and work and job redesign. And at least partially, this is meant to drive greater efficiency and frankly, cost savings, because one of the things that we know about the post-COVID world, everybody's in recession, or virtually every country in the world is right now in recession. And so cost is going to be an incredibly important thing to ensure sustainability of organizations. Culture, and I'm going to talk further about this down the track, but people will be focusing on things like safety and well-being, purpose, ethics, redefining how leaders make employees feel connected and valued, and certainly in the thrust towards working from home, this has been a big challenge for many organizations. How do you keep people engaged when you never physically see them or have contact with them? So that's a focus. Technology and infrastructure, not surprisingly, accelerated digitization of services and digital excellence, and certainly a move towards providing people with the kind of technology that will make them productive no matter where they are in the world. If they're in their living room or the office, they should be equally productive. And certainly this has been driven extremely strongly by cloud initiatives, as well as video conferencing initiatives like Zoom, Teams, those sorts of things. And then big adjustments to the business operating models. How will we actually do our work? And one of the things that's a really interesting suggested trend is that there would be a relocalization of many services where we've had globalization. And in fact, if you look at politics has gone very much this way, where you've had a bunch of really nationalist style politicians rather than the internationalist style politicians. And what many of these consulting firms are saying is that this is likely to happen with service provision as well. Rather than going to India, Pakistan, China to get stuff done, maybe we're more likely to have it done at home because many people have been burnt by the fact that they couldn't access products due to COVID-19 lockdowns or restrictions on trade. Key strategic themes. So if we sort of summarize this into 3 things: 1, business transformation. So telehealth, working from home, virtualization of services and businesses, All of those sorts of things are business transformations accelerated by COVID-19. The second point is attempts to disaster-proof businesses in response to issues such as the shutdown of traditional day services. So can these businesses be done some other way that doesn't make them so vulnerable? It's amazing how people's focus on risk has changed. Companies that in the world of commerce that traded quite successfully overnight lost 95% of their revenues, unheard of. So many people are focused on, well, how can we ensure that we create a business model that if you get another pandemic down the track, we will survive? And then, of course, the third kind of strategic component of all of this is just all the stuff that comes with economic downturns, recessions, survival and recovery. And certainly that's a key theme right across the world right now, how to survive in turn. So this really raises the question of what we can reliably assume in the disability sector in Australia. Well, we know that economic downturn happens and it is happening right now. And so what that leads to is a focus on sustainability rather than growth. We have seen very substantial growth focus in many organisations in the sector, and some have succeeded handsomely in that. But maybe there's going to be more of a focus on economic sustainability. If you're in the world of profit, you'd call it profit, margin, whatever, but certainly sustainability rather than growth. Cash is king, so people will be looking to make sure that their cash position is shored up, and also that their commercial models involve short cash-to-cash cycles. In other words, they're able to make sure that they don't carry large debtor loads for long periods of time. A drive for flexibility, in other words, new ways of doing things that don't rely on long-term contracts. I mean, I suppose a classic example is the leases on buildings. People will not want to take out a 3 to 5 year lease if they think that the future is unlikely to be certain. People are going to be hesitant to spend money. That's just a reality of every recession. Greater caution from purchases of services, consumerism, and changes in availability of talent. And we'll be talking a fair bit about this later in the presentation. A persistence in the increase in remote working. Well, I think that one of the things that we can reliably state is that it's unlikely that everybody's going to go back to offices. Certainly, organisations have found, well, you know, this whole working from home thing works better than perhaps we thought it was going to. So that's great. Let's persist with that. Maybe instead of having X numbers of square meters of office space, we need X minus 30, 40, 50%. And in tough times, that's a real blessing. Embracing of new technologies. Will we really get in a plane for a 2-hour meeting in future? I suspect that many of the trips that we've done in the past to have meetings, let's say a 2-hour meeting in Sydney or Adelaide or whatever, maybe we just got to do those by Zoom. I think we've all practiced it so much that we know that it can get a result. And after all, who wants to pay the plane fare in tough times? Alternative business models, different ways of providing services, such as telehealth. We do know, for instance, that federal governments historically have been cautious about telehealth because they felt that it was a compromising of service. Now they've embraced it enthusiastically because of COVID-19. Is it likely they'll go back to denying people who want telehealth the opportunity to access it? I strongly doubt that. I think that things like telehealth are going to be very much part of the future. And what that may well lead to is less bricks and mortar, less offices and more virtualized services and virtualized locations. And will there be strategy based on a memory of COVID-19, an attempt to catastrophe-proof businesses, localization, those kinds of things? Now, if you look at the NDIS services, so these are the 15 funded services under the National Disability Insurance Scheme here in Australia, and you will see that some of these things are things that you would consider to be able to be delivered quite comfortably by digital format, and some of them really can't. So for instance, if you've got, well, improved living arrangements, that includes supported independent living. Well, that's just something that you can't really provide digitally. You have a range of services that need to be provided physically. And whereas some of these other things, such as, I don't know, maybe home modifications, you would imagine that some of those things could be conducted and transacted largely digitally. Improved health and well-being. I mean, certainly we're seeing in the area of psychosocial counselling, e-counselling is becoming a very strong focus. And it's really interesting seeing counsellors, clinical psychologists, those kinds of people, they have been extremely busy during the COVID-19 crisis. So it is interesting how, from a focus and economic point of view, different sectors have had upturns and downturns based on this crisis. So economic downturn, just to focus a little bit more on that and what it means. Harvard Business School study of business strategies in recession. And by the way, one of the authors for this was the dean of the Harvard Business School. So we presume that he's in a good place to make these comments. They looked at many recessions in the United States of America and across the world. And they discovered that the number one strategy that was used by organizations in recession was cost cutting. How can we reduce costs? The second most commonly used strategy was aggressive promotion of growth, where they said, okay, well, we're losing revenue, so we need to get revenue from somewhere else. And the aggressive promotion of growth might have been advertising or pricing strategies or whatever, lateral thinking to get new customers. And then the option number three is a combination of one and two. So you cost cut where you can cost cut, but you might increase your marketing budget. So you might cost cut in service provision, but increase your marketing budget. And you can imagine politically, internally, that there's a bit of a difficulty there, because the people who are on the downside don't feel so good about the fact that other people are on the upside. There's a problem with that. And what they discovered is that the organizations that recovered most quickly from economic downturn, in fact, didn't do 1, 2, or 3. They took a progressive approach, an excellence approach, a flexible approach, an evidence-based and experimental approach, trying to do everything as well as they possibly could and keeping very, very close to their customer. So that was the strategy which proved to be most effective for recovering from recession. Now, they also had some very interesting statistics about recession. Things like recessions have rarely lasted less than 3 years. Now, here in Australia, we've had lots of discussion about what people call a V-shaped recovery, that after the COVID-19 thing goes, that you're going to see this roaring back into commercial success. Economists who've been associated with the Australian Treasury, for instance, are very skeptical about that. They've said, well, look, when we got unemployment up to 10%, it took years and years and years to get it back down to 5, 4, 6%. So recessions rarely last less than 3 years. So I think we can presume that times will be tough for here in Australia for the next 3 years if previous recessions are anything to go from. They also found that 17% or close to 20% of large companies disappeared during these times, either went broke, merged with somebody else, or simply changed their business model so markedly they couldn't be identified as the same company. So that says that there's going to be changes in the corporate landscape, the structure of a number of companies. And most companies who made it through the recession, once the recession was officially over, they took about 3 years to get back to where they had been before the recession. So we do know that economic recessions can have lasting effects on organizations. Now, I'm not trying to be gloomy here, but I guess if you're taking a workforce planning perspective, it's probably best to assume that the next 2 to 3 years are going to be tough, rather than to bank heavily on the fact that everything's going to be coming back, roaring back into prosperous and happy times anytime soon. So a longer term perspective on being responsible, being parsimonious, being strategic, being flexible, trying to find new ways of doing things, that looks like it could be the best strategy. So the implications for this, well, in Australia, we haven't had a recession for nearly 30 years and we've got one now. One of the things that I think really becomes important in economic times like this is the idea of critical mass. And I've coined the phrase critical mass becomes, well, critical. And what that means is that organizations in such times tend to either get big or get highly specialist. In a way, the worst thing to be in an economic downturn is a medium-sized generalist, because what that means is in the various services that you offer, you don't really have critical mass in any one of them. If you do one thing really well, you can have critical mass without being huge. But if you're going to get critical mass in multiple services, you probably need to be big so that each of those services do have critical mass. In other words, they have the sort of economic strength to be able to survive and prosper during tough times. So I can't tell you how many times I've been asked this by members of the sector, what happens when JobKeeper finishes, because obviously many of the services that organisations have provided historically are closed right now, and they don't know when they're going to open. And so that makes it very difficult to build a financial model. And we know that financial reserves vary very widely from organisation to organisation in the sector. Some not-for-profits in the disability sector have retained earnings equivalent to maybe a couple of years' revenue. Some have run very lean for a long period of time. But I think that one of the things that's interesting, when in preparation of this, I spoke to a number of chief executives and chairs of boards in organisations across the sector, and it was amazing how many of them mentioned significant increases in mergers and acquisitions activity. In other words, their organisations being approached by smaller organisations saying, look, we just can't do this anymore in this climate. Can you take these services and can you provide them? Because we're just not able to. So I think, sadly to say, there is to be consolidation in the sector. That happens every time there's an economic downturn, and certainly a range of other things in the NDIS world have driven this consolidation, but economic downturn is a big part of that. And so slimmer, more virtualized business models are likely to be, and less offices, as we've mentioned previously. So the implications for talent, well, it may well be that if you're going to prosper in these times, you're going to have to take that model for perspective that the Harvard Business School came up with. So an excellence perspective, doubting everything about the way we've done things in the past and finding better ways of doing them. So that means agility, flexibility, contribution to a positive and responsive corporate culture, contribution to digitization, remote employees, and of course the skills to lead a remote workforce in amongst leaders. So they may be new competencies for some organizations. And it also raises the question, one of the vexed problems, of course, in the whole disability world is to recruit direct support workers. So will tough times make it easier to recruit direct support workers? Well, maybe, and I'll deal with that in a few slides' time. So just to introduce you to the idea of workforce planning. Now, workforce planning means different things to different people. And so workforce planning, if you Google that term, you will find a lot of software. People think that workforce planning is software. We don't at SACS. Just to give you a brief history of workforce planning, myth number one is it's new. It's not. And in fact, you could say that forms of workforce planning have been used by the military as far back as the Napoleonic era. Perhaps even ancient Egypt. There is evidence that in ancient Egypt, the pharaohs used to plan new settlements to give them the soldiers necessary to fuel the army. And they used to quantify, okay, well, we need a settlement that's going to have 1,000 people because that'll give us X number of soldiers. I mean, that's a workforce planning model. By the way, it's amazing how many human resources techniques have come from the military over the years, including, for instance, 360-degree feedback that was invented by the military some decades ago. In the US, in the 50s, something like 80% of Fortune 500 companies had workforce plans, now less than 40%. Why? Well, the reasons that the models were often very complicated. They tried to predict too precisely. In science, we call this spurious accuracy. Spurious accuracy is where you say, in 10 years, we're going to need 642 direct support workers. Well, no one can know that. That's spurious accuracy. It's better to have predictions which are likely to be worth making. Too long term, 10 years plus, we know that trying to predict 10 years out is very inaccurate and frankly not worth the trouble. And it's often seen as a forecasting exercise. We believe that workforce planning is an organizational development exercise. It's a change activity, which is all about bringing the people planning process to the center of the business and aligning it with strategy. So what should a workforce planning model be? Well, we think it should determine how the workforce is going to deliver strategy. It's amazing how many workforce plans I've seen in my life that make no mention about the clarity of strategy. Well, workforce planning surely is to ensure that the workforce can deliver what the organization needs to deliver. If it can't do that, then it is not worth having. It should be simple. I guess my personal objection going back 20 years ago when I built the SACS model of workforce planning is how complicated workforce planning models were, how difficult to understand. So if you're going to undertake a multifaceted project like workforce planning, you really need simplicity and clarity for all stakeholders. It should make it clear what the components are, what needs to be done, should guide action. And here's a really important point. If you undertake workforce planning, the worst thing you can do is to have it as a bolt-on to the organization's true business. It should be the storehouse for your intellectual capital on workforce matters. What do I mean by that? Well, how do we train people? That should live in the workforce plan. How do we recruit people? That should live in the workforce plan. How do we ensure that our recruitment methods are successful? Our approach and our techniques should be in the workforce plan. So the workforce plan becomes a core central mechanism for running people management in your organization and for ensuring that it's proactive rather than reactive. That's when workforce planning is working well. When it's working badly, it's a bolt-on or it's jogging along beside the organization rather than being at the core of how the organization makes its people decisions. So it should be proactive rather than reactive. Now, are you ready for workforce planning? The first question you have to ask yourself is what your strategy is like. So workforce planning? Well, workforce planning for what? If you haven't got clarity of strategy, it's incredibly difficult to come up with a workforce plan. And the value you get out of workforce planning will be determined by the clarity of your strategy. And sadly, I must say that many organizations that we've worked for in workforce planning thought that they had a strategy, but what they had was vision or tactics. Vision in the sense of a grand view of where we're heading, or tactics in terms of micro work plans. So in virtually all of the workforce planning projects we've worked on, they've required operationalization of strategy. Now, what do I mean by operationalization of strategy? Taking it from concepts and turning it into something which is clear for each employee and also has an accountability framework linked to it. If you've got those components, clarity and accountability, then you've got strategy. And true strategy is informed by clear outcomes. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So if you want to understand what an organization is for, yeah, you can write a bunch of stuff about, well, this is what this organization is for. Here are the tasks that we need to undertake. Here are the things that we need to do. But in fact, I believe that strategy comes from, and clarity in strategy comes from outcomes. What are the outcomes that this organization needs to achieve? So if you've got an organization which is about reducing gambling, well, you should say, we are going to reduce gambling amongst our clients by this amount. If you've got an organization which is about causing people to achieve their outcomes, let's say people with disability, they seek to achieve certain outcomes. If you've got a mechanism that measures the outcomes and whether they're being achieved, and you've got an opportunity to report that at an organizational level, our people are achieving their outcomes to the tune of 70% on average, well, that's a fantastic thing. That's what the organization is about. Other outcomes might be things like commercial sustainability. They could also be things like the degree to which you want your workforce to be engaged, or you want positive metrics in your workforce. It could be things like the degree to which you're going to be effective in advocacy. So we achieve outcomes by virtue of having influenced public policy or government policy in these ways and in this measurable form. So the idea is many organizations haven't decided what they need to achieve at the organizational level, so they're not good at cascading that down into divisions or departments or whatever you want to call them, and branches, work units, and then to the individuals. Clarity is 5 to 7 real world outcomes at all levels of an organization. Now, the term real world outcomes, that's a SACS invention. And the reason that we invented that was to try to differentiate this idea of outcomes, because I think a good outcome is some way in which we as an organization or as an employee make the world a better place. But we call them real world outcomes to differentiate them from micro things like KPIs, key result areas, those sorts of things. Because we've seen so many organizations that drown in a total multiplicity of KPIs or KRAs that, I mean, if you've got a lot of KPIs and a lot of KRAs, it makes it very hard to understand what the purpose of an organization is. Why do we say 5 to 7? This is from research in psychology, which shows that people can keep to the front of their mind typically 5 to 7 things. So if you have 5 to 7 outcomes, measurable outcomes for a person's job, what that means is that they're likely to remember that. If you have 20 KPIs, the probability of them remembering that very, very low. 5 to 7 outcomes will mean that people will have those outcomes in the front of their mind. Now, this works at the job level. And so this is a thing called outcome-based job definition. And in our workforce planning activities, we've taught many organizations how to do outcome-based job definition. The good news about outcome-based job definition is that you can have an entire job description on a page. One A4 page can easily cover a job description because it's defined by 5 to 7 measurable outcomes. Now, I know that people love to put a list of tasks in job definitions. Lists of tasks are not shown to be particularly clarifying as to what a job needs to achieve. People can have the list of tasks, but the list of tasks becomes obsolete very rapidly. Outcomes tend to be more enduring. So for instance, if an outcome of my job is that I have to make these customers happy, and there's a form that they fill in once a month that tells us whether they're happy or not, I mean, that's an outcome. Okay, so my job is to make people happy. Do you really need a list of things that a person needs to do? Of course you need training, you need skills development in the background, but doesn't need to be in the job description. If your employees can remember just these outcomes that they need to achieve, then that is a big step forward. Then what you might like to do is to list the competencies necessary to achieve those outcomes, the skills, experience or qualification, and the sort of style stuff. Here you go, one A4 page. Now, we have introduced this to organizations which had very low job clarity when we measured it. We can measure that with our measurement instruments for well-being. And by introducing this idea of outcome-based job definition, real-world outcomes exercise going from the top, such as in this diagram here, start off at the top and then cascade that down into outcomes of all of these different levels. We've been able to move organizations from, let's say, 20th percentile for job clarity to 80th percentile in a matter of a couple of months. Simplicity works. What we want is simple solutions, and simple job definitions and simple clarification of strategy can be very powerful. So what this does is it takes strategy and it turns it into accountability, creates accountability at all levels, a governance structure, if you want to put it that way, creates psychological clarity for staff, a key foundation for engagement, and it avoids myriad KPIs. In boards in the United States of America, a phrase that's often used is 20 is plenty, which is to say, if you're going to run a major corporation, when the board gets together, they don't want to see 100 stats. They want to see 20 stats for an entire organization. 20 is plenty. So clarity comes from less, not more. Now, I think that strategy has never been so crucial. I mean, here in Australia, we're undertaking the most significant economic downturn almost in the country's history. Certainly, we haven't seen anything like this for decades and decades. And so you may like to, as part of the preparation for workforce planning or as part of the workforce planning venture itself, undertake an outcomes assessment based on the new world, key outcomes at the various organizational level, and then build an accountability framework. How are we going to measure whether these things are being achieved? Develop a governance structure. And of course, to maximize engagement, you should always do these things as collaboratively as possible. Empowerment is the single most powerful mechanism for keeping people engaged. So we would recommend strongly that you do this on an empowered basis. And then you can consider how to ensure that you've got the workforce necessary. So in the light of all of that, this is a thing that we call the SACS model of workforce planning. And so just briefly to describe how it works, you have the current state here. What is the current state of our workforce? And by the way, I'll work through these components to explain how they work. Then you look at the environmental factors. Well, talking about that, I mean, clearly right now we have a pandemic. I mean, if there's ever been an environmental factor, that's it. But you also have a range of other things, don't you? You have things associated with legislation, you have things associated with expectations of the purchasers of services under the NDIS. You've got a range of different environmental factors. Then you have to decide the time horizon you want your workforce plan to operate under. You see, we're suggesting 2 years here, and I'll get to that in the course of the presentation. Then you have the future state, which is your forecast. And your forecast really has to be based on this idea of what strategies we need to undertake What are the outcomes we need to achieve now? What are the outcomes that we need to achieve future? But you actually have to undertake a forecasting exercise. And by the way, one of the things that we find is that when organizations start to forecast, as they do it year by year, they get better and better. It's a competency building exercise to become good at forecasting. Then, of course, you have to look at the question of what will the environment be like 2 years down the track. Hard to forecast, I know, but if you look at some of the suggestions about the new normal, some of that might help. And then all of this is underpinned by enablers, which are things like process, culture, including leadership. So these are all your recruitment methodologies, your learning and development methodologies, all of those things that help us to achieve the workforce of the future. So let's talk about some aspects of the current state of the environment. So that's quite often an analysis of where are you now? The demographics, aging, gender, diversity. It's fascinating to me that when you start doing this for organizations, they're very often surprised at their own makeup. Oh, so that's our average age. Oh, so this is our gender mix. Some, of course, have done this and understand it inside and out, but many organizations haven't and don't realize how these kinds of things can affect their future. A classic example is that when we've undertaken hotspot analysis for staff turnover, so an organization's got, let's say, 25% staff turnover, which by most organizations is relatively high. Where's it coming from? A hotspot analysis might suggest, actually, you know, the people who are leaving are people who've been here for less than a year and a half. Or it may be, hey, the turnover is all in one division. Or it may be, hey, it's spread right across the organization. You can understand that if you find this turnover hotspot analysis telling you things that you didn't know about your staff turnover, that can be incredibly helpful for how to address the issue. Location issues. Where is everybody? Well, we believe that they're going to be working more remotely in future. Talent gaps and hard to resource areas, and we'll be talking about some of those in the disability sector in just a moment. So you can benchmark these things. You can benchmark a range of issues which tell us whether we're atypical, typical, in comparison with other organizations in similar sectors. And that also might inform practice, things that you're going to do. It's going to be a fascinating exercise and one which usually yields immediate value. We have, for instance, ended up telling organizations that their combination of staff turnover and the age demographic of their workforce means that, I remember one client, we explained to them that they may well lose a quarter of their workforce in 1 year. They had quite an elderly workforce, and they also had quite marked staff turnover. That combination, because of people retiring and also the staff turnover compounding with it, can cause an enormous statistic of people departing the organisation all in one go. And that was a really interesting challenge for them. Let's talk briefly about current environmental challenges. Well, irrespective and before the COVID-19 thing, increasing compliance burdens. Organisations are being placed under increasing demand for statistical reporting, for ensuring that they comply with contracts, probity, those kinds of things. Now, we totally understand why this has happened. There have been questionable practices in some organisations, but there is no doubt that there is an increasing compliance burden. Increasing expectations and awareness of options from purchasers of services. I think one of the things that has happened, and certainly many people in the sector have told me this, as people have become more aware of the NDIS, they've become more aware of their rights, and also advocacy services have become active. So that's a fantastic thing for people being able to live the life that they want to with disability. But of course, it places demands on organisations. Large legacy workforces with varying degrees of enthusiasm for the new world. I mean, the NDIS change shook out that workforce and drove quite a bit of consolidation. And certainly there were employees who really didn't like the NDIS. They preferred block funding. Now, if you're talking about a new normal where much more virtualization and digitalization of services, much more working from home, there will be people who love that, and there will be people who will be extremely uncomfortable with that. Now, and another thing I hear almost every day from people in the disability sector, low NDIS margins make it hard to develop staff. It also makes it hard to pay staff. And this drives low salaries. So NDIS growth has driven demand for workers. So you've had the fact that the jobs are not particularly well paid, but there has been growth in the total number of jobs. So for instance, with direct support workers in particular, organisations have struggled to find the people that they want. So working in the sector really, for many people, has been a labour of love. You know, they do this, they don't get paid particularly well, but they do it because they believe in it. They really value it. They think it's a really worthwhile way to live their lives. And of course, many people tell you and tell me how valuable it is, what a meaningful way of living it is, a meaningful way of working. Some organisations surviving only on JobKeeper, and the casualised workforce is currently constrained for working at multiple sites. So if you happen to be doing this as a labour of love and you've had a job structure where you've had multiple shifts in multiple locations in multiple companies, well, right now you don't have that, do you? And so you do wonder how long this situation will persist before it allows people to get back to working in such a way that they can get the kind of level of remuneration that they need. So this really raises an interesting question. What are disability sector employees really like? And so we pulled some statistics from our database. And so there'll be some things that you're going to like about what I've got to say about the psych profile disability sector, and there'll be some things that you don't like. And the first thing, and I don't think you're going to like this particularly much, this is data from some thousands of people. SACS has psych tested hundreds of thousands of people, literally, and many of them have been in the disability sector. And as you can see, the aged care and the general not-for-profit sector. These are cognitive abilities. Cognitive abilities being the ability to solve problems. And you see they come in three forms: verbal, numerical, abstract. Verbal is using words, numerical is numbers, and abstract reasoning is solving problems which are to do with strategy and tactics. This is population average in Australia for a professional population. And by the way, the people that are represented in this graph are largely people who are at managerial or at least team leader level, because very few of our clients test cognitive ability for direct support workers. But what you see is that the averages here are quite markedly below population average in Australia. And so, for instance, the disability sector, the green one here, about the 42nd or maybe 43rd percentile in verbal reasoning. So 50 is average in Australia. Numerical reasoning, markedly low, let's say 33, 34 percentile. By the way, a percentile means higher than anybody else who's taken this test in the past. So that's why 50 is population average. And around about 39 or 40%, 40th percentile for abstract reasoning. Now, why is it that the sector approaches or attracts people who have, on average, low cognitive ability? By the way, if you're listening to this and feeling offended, this has nothing to do with your cognitive ability. This is thousands of people. I am sure that you are a genius and you would not be represented by these low cognitive abilities. So please don't get offended on an individual basis. But if you measure enough people, what you will find is that cognitive abilities co-vary very closely with income. The sector pays less than commerce, and that's why cognitive abilities are lower than the world of commerce. Now, what does that mean? Well, we do know that higher cognitive abilities are helpful for organisations to prosper during times of change, because people with higher cognitive abilities can learn a bit more quickly, can solve more problems, can be more flexible. Cognitive ability is a good predictor of work outcomes. By the way, one thing I also should say is that we have clients who test heavily on the way in for cognitive ability, and despite the fact that they are in the sector and they pay sector wages, you might well find that they're at the 60th percentile because they're screening all the way through when they recruit. Anyway, the essence of it is the sector is a little below population average. And by the way, you see all of these not-for-profit sectors, for practical purposes, these are fairly similar levels of cognitive ability, given that they're different from population average. So, and if we look at the values of the sector, it's a different profile. And so we're going to look at three sectors once more: aged care, disability, and the general not-for-profit sector. By the way, general not-for-profit sector is things like peak bodies, community organisations, organisations that are associated with associations, those kinds of things. They're general not-for-profit. And the first thing you notice, the statistician in me says, well, these are practically the same workforce, really, aren't they? They're incredibly similar. This is population average in Australia, And so when we normed this, we normed it with thousands and thousands of people. And you can see that people who work in the sector are just not average people. They are not particularly power focused. So this is the Schwartz model of values, and power is one of the Schwartz values. Achievement is a sense of ambition. So again, not overly ambitious. By the way, these are percentiles again. Hedonism is about having enjoyable experiences. And so around about population average, maybe just a smidge below, but look how low on self-direction. So what that means is that people in the sector tend to be comfortable to take instruction from other people, or their value set says, look, it's fine to take instruction from other people. Values are largely learned in the course of life, and they're not a genetic thing in the way that cognitive ability is or personality is. So people learn values. But one of the things that I think this shows is that people who are highly self-directed are going to other sectors, not to the not-for-profit sector. Universalism is, I want to make the world a better place. And that is, of course, where the members of the sector excel. They do want to make the world a better place. And I think that's a big motivation for people. So that's a sort of a sense of social justice. And certainly organisations in the disability sector, many organisations and individuals are driven by that sense of social justice. Benevolence is about wanting to help individuals. Tradition is all about doing things the way my society or religion or my family tells me they should be done. You notice that that's where you get a divergence. The aged care sector is a little higher. And also going back to universalism, the disability sector, look at that 80th percentile. I mean, that's really high. And what it means is that people in the sector are extremely principled, extremely driven by a passion for social justice. And then we have conformity. And what that means is that people in the sector in general don't want to offend people. They don't want to do the wrong thing. They want to do the right thing. And finally, you'll see that they're quite high. All three sectors are quite high on security. Means that they want to do the safe thing. So it paints the picture of not an overly driven sector, certainly a very principled sector, and a sector that wants to do the right thing by people. It's certainly a sector where it can be hard to find people to step up and lead, because there's not a particular drive for self-direction in too many people. Of course, once more at the individual level, of course, there are people who will be up here, but as a sector, it's surprising how consistently low that is. And of course, conformity. Now, this really raises a question about change, doesn't it? Because what it means is that many people in this sector will be saying, well, okay, where is the change coming from? And also, if people feel that change is unsafe or unlikely to be a good thing, they're likely to be uncomfortable with it. Personality. This is the personality profiles of some hundreds of direct support workers in the sector. And what you see here is that you've got people who are extremely high in a thing called honesty, humility. That is wonderful. These are not percentiles, by the way. These are standard scores, T-scores as they're called. 10 is a standard deviation. So 60 means a standard deviation above population average. If you're not into stats, all that you really need to care about is that if you're more than a half a standard deviation away from population average, that's high. So these are nearly a full standard deviation, and we're talking about hundreds of employees here. So a very principled, honest, and truthful group of employees. Low in anxiety. And I think that's interesting, because here we have emotionality, and emotionality, about population average, maybe a smidge sentimental, but very low in anxiety as a sector. So I think what that means is that to be a direct support worker, you really need to be a kind of a resilient person, because we know that low anxiety means higher resilience. People in the sector are largely extroverts. This has been demonstrated in a range of different studies, not massively so, but a bit above population average. It's a people-ish kind of game, so extroverts tend to like that. Agreeableness means not angry, means easy to get along with, means kind, approachable. And so look at that, a sector with very nice people. Conscientiousness, highly conscientious. So organised, a little above population in average in diligence, which means hardworking, perfectionism, which means detail-minded. but look how high in prudence. So people are attracted to this sector who are cautious, and maybe the people who aren't opt out because of the compliance regime. Openness to experience is all about how keen people are on new things, and yeah, just a little above population average. I mean, when you're really so close to population average, although it's a substantial sample, probably you could say about average in terms of open-mindedness. So the personality characteristic of open-mindedness is in fact more favourable than the values profile, which is probably a little bit more cautious and a little bit more compliant. So that's what support workers are like and what the sector is like in terms of the makeup of people. So what does that say? I think going back to what I said earlier about the labour of love, well, here you have it. The sector has been able to attract people who have wonderful characteristics in large numbers, people who are honest, truthful, very principled, want to do the right thing, care deeply. So that's a really interesting base to proceed from. I'm going to talk a little bit about the NDIS capabilities now, because this relates to what we've just covered. And I certainly want to thank Libby Goland of Ben Delta, who provided us with this information. This is really hot off the press. This capability framework has only recently been formed. And I want to talk about it in the context of workforce planning, because quite often in workforce planning, we undertake what's called competency family analysis, can be called capabilities. If you see competencies and capabilities, for most purposes, they mean exactly the same thing. Yes, people will tell you that they're not, but having read dozens of textbooks on the matter, when people talk about capabilities and competencies, pretty much they're talking about the same stuff. The idea of competency families is that you can differentiate different competency families. So leadership is a competency family in many organizations. Direct support work is a competency in many disability organizations. IT, for example, quality management. I mean, I've plucked out 4 that are common to many organizations, but what you can often find is that 80% of staff can be allocated to, let's say, 8 to 10 job families. So you can imagine if you've got 1,000 employees and 80% of your staff can be identified in 8 to 10 competency or capability families, this makes the process of people management much easier, because think of recruitment. You can build recruitment methodologies targeted at one of these 8 sectors. Think about training and development. Think about succession planning. Think about where we undertook a workforce planning project once where there were people scattered all over the length and breadth of Australia, and they were called all different things. But when we did our job family analysis, we found that there were really only about 6 job families in amongst something like 3,000 employees. And the nature of the organisation was that historically, because of a bunch of mergers and those sorts of things, they had thought of these employees as being quite different, state to state and location to location. We identified that there were job families, and that allowed them to consolidate many of their human resources practices and to get economies of scale, critical mass from doing that. That made a big difference. So just to tell you a little bit about the NDIS capability framework. So the framework has been developed. It's Australia-wide. It's intended to be an Australia-wide framework. It's intended to provide common language and perspective. It's a resource for the sector. It's not intended ever to be imposed on the sector. So we encourage you, as the sector rolls this capability framework out, to look at it and just decide how you see this fitting into your business. Is this something you want? If so, great. If not, then you might well decide that you will harvest the benefits that you might get from it, but it's certainly not intended to be imposed. So there's a second major part to the project, implementation. So that's yet to be commissioned, and it's likely to be happening over the next couple of years. Now, of course, government does have a lot on their agenda at the moment, but the intention right now is that the framework will be rolled out over the next couple of years. And the framework is written from the perspective of the participant, not from the perspective of the organisation or from the perspective of the government, but from the perspective of the participant. And I'm going to show you 2 infographics. This is the main infographic. So competencies or capabilities, clusters of capabilities, setting up our relationship for success. So things like upholding my rights, communicating effectively, knowing your capabilities, role and impact. So that's where practitioners or support providers need to be self-aware, need to work within their capabilities, and also need to maintain their own well-being in order to be able to provide good services. Support me to pursue what's important to me, so understand what a good life means to me. So that suggests capabilities associated with being able to communicate effectively, ask good questions, supporting me to make my own choices, building my capacity to participate, being present and providing the support that I need. So observe and respond flexibly to my changing needs, manage my safety, work with me to evaluate and act on what is working and what's not. So that's a kind of a continuous improvement kind of an activity. Now you see that there are ancillary services, general support, and advanced support. By the way, all of this is backed by a much more comprehensive publication which defines the competencies in each of these areas in more detail. What I'm really trying to do today is to show you a capability or an infographic of these capabilities, which create a far clearer perception as to what this framework will do. So key things, it's obviously based from the point of view of the participant, and 5 core competency or capability areas for people who are providing these services. Now you'll notice at the bottom here, there is this creating an enabling work environment. So things like enabling environmental capabilities, and once more, those are detailed in the fuller document. So how to manage, supervise, and coach each other, but also creating enabling work environments, such as the correct corporate culture for your organization. And so there are complementary and environmental and enabling environment capabilities. So things like complementary identity capabilities, being responsive to the person's identity, being it at sea, culturally and linguistically diverse, or LGBTQI plus, and complementary specialized support capabilities. So ensuring that I get the supports that I need and can be additional to call for advanced support, and enabling environmental capabilities, which is all about leadership and creating a right practice environment and an effective risk environment. Now, that's a brief introduction as to what the framework looks like. And so, for instance, if you are seeking to undertake a capability family analysis, such as I've described just briefly before in the description of how you can aggregate capability families in order to simplify your workforce planning exercise, well, maybe this is something you might like to consider as a framework for doing that. And if you're after more information on this, Jo Grizzard has kindly offered to be a contact, so feel free to contact her on mobile or on that email address. So there are a number of issues for you to consider in the light of all of this. So what's the capability in your work for a new business model? And one of the things that we've done for many organizations is what's called a hidden talents analysis. I'll give you a brief description of a hidden talents analysis. We had an organization that was changing its business from being a service provider to being an educator. This was a public sector organization, and it was a government decision that this organization would move from being a totally service provision organization to about 40% of what it did was to educate the public. So the organization began to consider scoping out roles for how these new educational roles would work, and that's good. They started to build outcome-based job definition. We were working with them to do this, and they started to say, well, maybe we have to recruit. And we said, well, maybe what you should do is identify whether these skills exist within your workforce. So we undertook a hidden talents analysis, which is a kind of a survey process and a focus group process sometimes. And what we discovered is that there were many people who had education backgrounds within the existing workforce. So they could, in effect, articulate those employees into these new roles without external recruitment. Now, this was a wonderful thing because these employees got to use talents that they hadn't used in the past. It caused the organization to be able to achieve its goals quickly and, frankly, economically, and a benefit for both the employees and the organization. So that may be worth doing. Are your employees suited to remote work? Not everybody is. Are your employees suited to working with new technologies? Once more, some people love it and some people struggle with it. Are your leaders equipped to lead remote employees and other transformative challenges that are likely to happen in the new normal? And one of the things that we know in an early part of a recession, talent availability increases, but there is a quality risk. So we undertook a very significant volume psych testing exercise for a particular type of organisation. So we're psych testing thousands of people per month for this organisation. And what we discovered is that as economic times got tougher, the jobs that we were psych testing for were relatively low-level jobs. What we found is that as economically times got tougher, the average IQ of employees increased, which meant that people who would historically maybe have taken other jobs were now attracted to these jobs, even though they were not particularly well paid or attractive in other ways. I think one of the things that we have to look out for is that you run the risk in the current climate of having the perfect storm of recruitment inefficiency. Many candidates and not always great. So you're going to have to process larger numbers of candidates, but will they be the right candidates for the sector? Will they have that perspective of the labour of love that I demonstrated you in the psych profiles of the people who are in the sector already? So that's the question that we need to ask. And so many organisations in the sector use this. It's a thing we call the SACS support worker assessment. Thousands of people in the sector have been assessed from this. It assesses personality characteristics. It assesses things like the likelihood of undertaking negative work behaviours. It assesses attitudes towards diversity, so gender, ethnicity, disability, and it's a short thing. So most people can do it in under 25 minutes and you can complete it on any instrument. So it uses what's called a 5-factor model of personality. I won't go into that in great detail, but this is what a report looks like. So here you have a risk summary on the front. By the way, all of the detail about these things is given in about 5 subsequent pages. But you see this person has low personality risk. Over the page, you would see exactly what their personality is. They also have low risk for gender, which means that they're not sexist, low ethnicity, which means they're not racist, low age, which means that they're not, shall we say, ageist, and low disability, which means that they should be comfortable in working with people who have disability, and also low counterproductive work behaviours, which says it's unlikely that they will do bad things. So that's an assessment that people use to identify whether people are likely to be a good risk for appointment into a support worker role. Then resilience. Many of our clients are testing for resilience, and that can be a very useful thing. It's only 5 additional questions, which, let's say if you're using one of these, you could add these 5 additional questions and get a resilience score. So you see that this is what a page of the report would look like. This person's got a 62 score, which is a high score in resilience, which means that their resilience risk is low. And so these are some of the benefits that you might gain from hiring a person like that. So I want to talk a little bit more about the enablers, process and culture now. And you will see, going back to the capability framework, the NDIS capability framework, they were really describing exactly the same thing, weren't they, when you look at those enabling culture kind of situations. So these are what's used to develop our talents and, in quotes, culture. I'm going to talk a little bit about culture in a second. So things like leadership, recruitment, talent management, succession management, performance development. And so this is what we call the build or buy question in developing the workforce of the future. Build is, okay, I have employees. I'm going to coach, train, develop, support them to be the employees that we need in the future. The buy equation is where you seek to recruit new people to be able to do these things that you need to do, to achieve the outcomes that you need to achieve. That's the build or buy question. So I just want to talk about culture. Culture, what's that? What do people mean when they talk about culture? You can imagine in my line of work, in organisational psychology, I get spoken to about culture just all the time. And if you look at books on culture, there are just dozens, hundreds probably, of definitions of culture. So one of the ones that's often quoted is from a gentleman by the name of Schein, S-C-H-E-I-N. It's the way we do things around here. Most conceptualizations of culture, because Schein then went on to say it's artifacts, espoused values, underlying assumptions. Well, what does that mean? I mean, you know, in science, one of the things that we often wonder is something unknowable? So what are the artifacts? What are the espoused values of an organization? They're not your formal values. We know that the formal values of organizations have nothing to do with the values that people actually have. I mean, I know people want them to, but they rarely do. Underlying assumptions, what are they? And the other question I would ask is it necessary to know all of this? I find that many organizations are actually sick of the whole culture discussion. I mean, it's kind of insulting to say that you need to change your culture. We're culturally ineffective. So from an org psych point of view, the definition that we've come to is that culture is behaviors. So behaviors, not values, behaviors. And it's as simple as this. You get good behaviors, you got good culture. You got bad behaviors, you got bad culture. Now, sadly, the balance between good behaviors and bad behaviors is not one-to-one. A bad behavior appears to be worth 3 to 6 good behaviors. In other words, if somebody does something bad, you kind of have to do 3 to 6 good things to bring everybody back to the levels of well-being that they had before anything was done. So we know that the more good behaviors that you can have and the more they outweigh the bad behaviors, the more people are going to say that it's a great corporate culture. One of the things that we now know from neuroscience evidence is that all this talk about culture may actually make it more difficult for people to change, particularly avoid discussions about culture change, because culture change is at best a process, but surely what we're trying to achieve is outcomes. So the advice from the neuroscience world and now embraced by the organisational psychology world from enlightened practitioners is focus on meaningful work outcomes. So imagine you're having a discussion with a direct support worker. We need to change our culture here. That's option number one. Option number two is let's work out a better way to give a good result to this recipient of services. I think I know which the person's going to be more enthusiastic about. Focus on work outcomes and reward agreed behaviors. So if you want to have a definition, we in fact don't do mission, vision, values organizations, mission, vision, values statements for organizations very often at all, unless they're prepared to have really specific behavior definitions. We feel that that's in fact taking money under false pretenses, because the research evidence for mission, vision, values improving organizations is extremely weak. So you can measure whether your staff are engaged, because if you've got a positive balance of good behaviors, then you're going to have levels of engagement. So this is our engagement instrument. This is just one page out of, it's like a summary page. So this is a work group of 124 employees, 32nd percentile. So that's below population average. And you can see 3 components. This is population average here: low in energy, low in flow, and low in commitment. These are 3 components that are often ascribed in the research world to engagement. And one of my challenges, one of the things I would be concerned about here, is that when you have low engagement like this, it tends to result in a phenomenon called change fatigue. Engagement is a very energetic, positive, proactive psychological state. When you have low engagement, you have low receptiveness of change or low enthusiasm for change. So I think you need to be very careful about bucketing on change when you have low engagement. Get the engagement high, and there are a range of ways of doing that. But the key way of doing that is to make sure that you have lots of positive behaviors as driven by leaders. Leaders behaving well gives rise to employees behaving well. That then gives rise to improvements in engagement. So talking about the time horizon now, naturally coincide with the corporate plan. Myth number 3 is go long. So research shows that on average, organisational forecasts tend to be wrong by 30%. So why would you go 10 years? I mean, 30% compounding over 10 years is considerably more than 300%. So we're starting to see now that even strategy consulting tends to be focusing on shorter terms. It just makes you wonder what the purpose is of all the effort involved in forecasting and planning beyond 3 years when it tends to be so inaccurate. So we suggest 2 years with what we call a rolling reforecast. So harmonize your workforce planning process with your budgeting process and redo it every year, but forecast 2 years out. Makes it more digestible, makes it easier to be accurate, and you get better and better at it as you rolling reforecast the activity. So then we talk about the environment and the future state. And so defining this future strategy, you base this on your strategy, the outcomes that you need to deliver and the competencies necessary to deliver them. And once more, the shorter the time frame, the more accurate you're going to be. You can consider projections about the environment. So the things that I've said about the new normal, you will form your own view as to whether they're likely to be right or not. If they are right, then they're useful for helping you to plan the environment of the future and to take that into account in your workforce planning. So we have a proprietary forecasting methodology for planning staffing types, levels and numbers. We call it metricated forecasting. This is where you will forecast maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 years out, saying, okay, we're going to need this number of employees of this type by this time. And of course, if you've done your outcome analysis, you'll be well placed to make these projections. If you know the outcomes that you're going to need to achieve in 2 or 3 years' time, then that will determine how accurately you will be able to determine the workforce that you're going to need in order to deliver these outcomes. So the final component of the workforce plan model is these people plans. And the people plans are really the build thing. What reskilling activities will take place? Who will receive them? When will it happen? How will you measure success? So you can imagine a people plan might look like we're going to train these people, we're going to skill these people, we're going to coach these people, we're going to mentor these people at this stage for this cost with this measure of success. Then the buy component. What positions will you hire? When? How? What's the success of each hire? How much will all this cost? And all of this enables you to build a business case for what's to be done, an accountability framework for effective delivery, a program of activities which could be reported on to the executive. Now, executives, of course, vary enormously in their enthusiasm for workforce planning. But if you deliver them the prospect of a workforce planning process which has this level of accountability, the probability of them being engaged is vastly higher. Finally, base the workforce plan on a rolling reforecast annually. The model's therefore constantly correcting and moving forward. And let's say something big happens halfway through a year, you just reset it. So something happens. I mean, a classic example would be if you've got a workforce plan and then COVID-19 comes along, you can use the workforce plan to help you to respond to that challenge, a flexible and responsive tool. So that's what the model looks like in its totality. Now, leadership of workforce planning, you have 3 options. You don't have 3 options. Clearly, this is a continuum. But option 1 is where you would do it top down. Option 2 is you would ask people's opinion and then decide what you want to do. Model 3 is where you would work with the employees. You would cause them to be heavily involved in the entire exercise. You will decide which of these models is the most appropriate to use in your leadership of this challenge. But I will tell you one thing, and that is that if you're using model 3, often your levels of engagement from staff, and so therefore their enthusiasm, their levels of commitment, their tendency to support what you're trying to do, they will be much higher than if you use just model 1 or model 2. So facilitative leadership, where a leader causes the staff to be involved in determining what we're going to do, causes people to do this stuff rather than just asking their opinions. This is what I like to call unbossing. This is the contemporary approach to leadership. And leadership through facilitation, obviously not all the time, because you do need to be a boss some of the time. Hey, troops, this is what's been decided. The board has decided this is not negotiable. Clearly, there are times when you need to ask people's opinions on things and then decide yourself. But then, of course, if you can do this, and this is probably the rarest of the 3, if you're good at choosing when to do this, workforce planning can be far more supported by staff and far more engaged in by staff than if you're just using model 1 or model 2. So in summary, the new normal is going to be difficult. We know that it's going to be economically tougher. It's going to be more flexible. It's going to be more digital. There are going to be more remote employees. And an excellence orientation will be very valuable, evidence-based leadership. I think clearly, clear and measurable strategy is going to be really important. Workforce planning will help you to adjust and prepare, and consider the psychological strengths that you're going to need in the future. I think this question of the morphing of the talent pool is going to be a really important one. I have absolutely no doubt that over the next 1, 2, 3 years, there are going to be more people available to our sector than historically has been the case. I think you're going to have to be more selective than you have been in the past. because we're going to find many people who are really not suited to the sector choosing to try the sector because they can't get other jobs. So I think it paints the picture of an exciting opportunity. It's certainly transformation, and there is an opportunity to plan how you're going to respond to this through the use of workforce planning. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that your efforts of workforce planning are highly successful.